Hello, friends of Viking cruises. Welcome to this Museum Monday. I'm the director of the MUNCH Museum in Oslo, Norway, and it's great to see you. It's very special times, and I'm very happy that we can still stay together in formats like this. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about Edvard Munch, his life and his work, and then at the end I'll take some questions. I can see some questions is already coming in. And some of you might have also experienced our last Museum Monday, and at that time we also got a lot of questions. I couldn't answer all of them, of course, but some of them were really interesting, so I was going to do that starting today and answer some of that questions. And then I'll take the rest of the questions coming in while we talk about Munch at the end of the session. So, of course, there is a lot of questions of the Scream. That's his most famous work, Edvard Munch we are talking about. And for example, one person, Ronnie from New York City, he asks if it was stolen. And you might know there is several editions of Edvard Munch's Scream. And one edition is at the National Museum in Oslo, and that was actually stolen in 1994. And returned a few weeks later. And the Scream at the MUNCH Museum, one of our Screams, because we have several, was stolen in 2004. And that was armed robbery, and the work was given back to us in 2008, so we were very happy about that. Of course, it was stolen together with Madonna, which is another of Edvard Munch's icons. So we are very happy to have those works back. They were a little bit destroyed actually, so we had to do a lot of conservation work, and that's something we're going to talk about next Monday, the conservation of the Scream. But still we have them, and yes, they were stolen and brought back. Another question is about the character on the work. Is that somebody that we know or Edvard Munch knew? Well, actually it's himself, because he has a text about this work, and as I mentioned last Monday, it's not the protagonist or the character in the work that screams, it's the nature that screams at the character, and so the character has to close his ears to protect himself from this scream. And Edvard Munch says that he was walking one evening with friends outside of Oslo, and the nature was actually screaming at him. It turned red and vibrant, and it was very frightening. And so that's the kind of the inspiration of the very famous Scream work. And there is a question also of cardboard. Is it made on cardboard? Unfortunately, I would say that Edvard Munch, 4 of his most famous Screams, 2 pastels, 2 paintings, was made on cardboard. For some reason, we are not sure exactly, but you can see the cardboard in the work some places, so that might be the reason. But of course, cardboard is very fragile. So over the years, if you know you have an old newspaper at home, it gets very crumbly and it disappears. And so we had to really take care of the Munch Screams, because they are all on cardboard, except for the prints and except for the drawings. But the most famous versions is on the cardboard. So that's what I have to say about the Scream. We're going to do some more about Scream later on. I already announced, so it will be possible to have more questions about this iconic work by Edvard Munch, probably one of the most known works in the world. Another question that we get, and also today, from Pam in Connecticut. Last Monday we got it from Charles in San Diego about the new museum. Some of you might know that we are building a new museum for the collection of Edvard Munch's works. And the old museum was opened in 1963 based on Edvard Munch's testament that he made during the war, and he gave everything that he owned to the city of Oslo. So it was a museum opened after the war in 1963. That's kind of old now. It's a wonderful museum, but it's very small, and we need to have something more modern and something bigger so that we can show more of the collection and also show more of Munch in other kinds of contexts. I see there is a lot of questions coming in, so that's good. I'm going to answer that later on. So anyway, we are going to open the new museum this fall, hopefully. It's a little bit fragile now because of the coronavirus. We have a lot of people at the MUNCH Museum that is working on the building project and the movement of more than 40,000 objects. So it's a lot of work. But anyway, we hope to be opening this October. It already has been delayed. It was supposed to open in June this year. So I wish you welcome to Oslo to experience the new Munch Museum opening this year 5 times bigger than what we have today. So it's going to be a lot of exhibitions and a lot of other activities for all kinds of interests. So we're really looking forward to that. So I think one more question from last Monday. It's what is my favorite? Well, I have many favorites, I have to say. All the Munch works are basically my favorites, and that's true to some extent because I always see new things in Edvard Munch. It's very, very interesting to go into other works that I wasn't familiar with before and to experience new things in his oeuvre, his production. So, but still I have one work that I think is really, really fascinating. Well, not one of the icons because, of course, they are also very fascinating and there is a reason why they are famous, but Starry Night by Edvard Munch. That was made in 1922 and probably he was inspired by Van Gogh and his Starry Night from 1889. And that work has a lot of possibilities for interpretation. I think there is some shadows there. The stars are coming towards you. It's a little bit scary work, but very beautiful. And of course, also to some extent, kind of cozy. But there is a lot of possibilities. So we're going to come back to that work also later on in this Museum Mondays. And what was his last painting? The last, let's say, famous painting is Between the Clock and the Bed, where he depicts himself standing between the clock and the bed. And the bed has a bedcloth that is resembling the sarcophag culture from Egypt. So it's like a bed, but it's also a coffin. And the clock, of course, has been in visual art a symbol of time and time going and time running. And of course, life is also running. And between the clock and the bed, he's an old man. And he's very much concerned at the end of his life to depict himself in self-portraits being an old man and what it means to be old, what it means to be an old man. So that's the questions from last time. And now I'm going to say a little bit about Edvard Munch himself, because I guess that some of you know that he was born in 1863. He died during the war in Norway in 1944. So that's his lifespan. He's a very relevant artist even today. And sometimes I use some time explaining and giving you a picture of what that actually means. Because I was very fascinated when I came to the Munch Museum. My background is a musician. I was head of the National Opera in Bergen before I came to the Munch Museum. And I've been a manager of several ensembles and orchestras. But anyway, coming to the Munch Museum, there was such an enormous interest internationally. And I was thinking, this isn't so well known in Norway that you have this enormous relevance for people all over the world. And to give some questions and some pictures about that. First of all, some of you might know that one of the Scream editions, one of the pastels, was sold at Sotheby's in New York in 2012. And it reached the high price of $120 million. So that was, at that time, a record for a public auction. And that shows a little bit of what we are talking about. Another thing is that there is about between 20 and 30,000 articles written internationally about Edvard Munch every year, 20 to 30,000. To put that into context, that's 4 times more than Norway, the country of Norway. So that's also an indication. And the last indication I'm going to give you is that we have about 60 informations every year from museums all over the world that want to have Munch exhibitions. And we try to be out there. We are doing 4 or 5 bigger exhibitions every year outside of Norway. But of course, we cannot fulfill all these dreams about showing Edvard Munch everywhere. But that's also an indication of the popularity, I would say, of Edvard Munch today, 70 years after he died, more than 70 years after he died. So that's an indication. Well, Edvard Munch, he's very much a part of Norwegian identity, I would say, certainly a Norwegian voice. He's a very big part of our culture and our art history, but also he means a lot to people all over the world. He's considered to be the father of German Expressionism, and in that sense also Expressionism in a more general term, and he's one of the forefathers of modernism. And to give you one example of what makes Edvard Munch a father of modernism is that he says about his work that I'm not painting what I see, I'm painting what I saw. So he's not trying to depict the actual things that he sees around himself, but he's trying to depict the emotion, the feeling, the impression that it made on him. So that's another way of changing art history, going from trying to depict what you see, realism, naturalism, and then going over to the modernism, where you are more concerned with emotions and feelings and impressions than you are actually about what you see specifically. So that's one part of very important and one reason why he's supposed to change art history into the beginning of modernism. He was an artist for more than 60 years. He has a production of more than 40,000 artworks. So that's an enormous production. He was very productive. And when he died, he had 2/3 basically of his collection, of his total production in his home at Ekeli in Oslo. That was 28,000 artworks. So that's the artworks we have at the MUNCH Museum. This is our collection. We also have some other artists, but our core collection is these 28,000 artworks by Edvard Munch. Of course, that's a variety of formats and forms. He's doing paintings, obviously. He's a very, very famous printmaker. He started doing prints when he was quite a young man. And there is also photography. He used the camera when he came. He used the possibility of making films when the film camera came. So he was very modern in his approach to trying to get deeper into his art. And also he has a few sculptures. So there's a variety of expressions in Edvard Munch's works. And then, going to his life, he was a very weak child. So he was a lot of time in bed. He didn't have a proper education, not even in art. So he was, as a young man, sent by his father to a technical drawing school, which gave him some technical, let's say, tools, but he never had actually a good education. So he was taught in the beginning by his mother, but she died when he was 5 years old. And then his aunt, Karen, who was very important to him, came into his life, the sister of the mother. And she, of course, was trying to give Edvard Munch some education, but he was basically self-sufficient in that sense. His sister also died of tuberculosis when Edvard Munch was 13. So he had a very difficult childhood, which we also can see in his works. Of course, he has a lot of works connected to disease and death. And I don't think he's actually trying to be biographical in his works. He wants to talk to us about problems that we face as human beings, but still, I think he has some very strong experiences, very deep knowledge of what it means to lose somebody that he loves very, very, very much. As a young artist, he was given a scholarship very early, so he was recognized. He was very controversial. He made a work called Sick Child, which uses a very crude technique, I would say. It's different techniques, it's painting, it's drawing. Actually, he uses nails to scrape the surface, so it looks very raw, and the child is sick. It's a very strong impression, and that was his breakthrough in Norway. That was very controversial. People thought he was mad, or he couldn't paint, or he didn't have any relevance whatsoever. He was an amateur, but it turns out that that is one of the very, very important works in his oeuvre, and also very important works in the change between the naturalism and the modernism. So that was where he actually started to create his own visual language in that work. I would say as an artist, of course, you need to be without compromises. So he's totally without compromises, and he's totally honest. He's not scared to show everything about himself, go deep into himself, and he's constantly also trying to get deeper into problems that we face as human beings. I mentioned last Monday that he has, of course, as you know, or at least some of you know, that he's doing works like melancholy, jealousy, disease, death, all kinds of very difficult problems that we face. And also he made a lot of works connected to the Spanish flu that took a lot of lives, a little bit like the coronavirus we see today, but at that time there was no possibility for any help, so a lot of people died, and Edvard Munch probably had the Spanish flu himself, and he depicts this in his works. But he also had a bright side. He's also doing nature, he's doing children, a lot of works of children playing, being dressed for certain occasions, or going into the woods. So it's a lot of also brighter, wonderful works that is about love and friendship and all the things that we also face as human beings, but are not that difficult to deal with. So as a young artist, he went abroad, and he stayed abroad for 20 years, first in Berlin, then in Paris, then back to Berlin. Actually, that was a mistake. He went first to Paris and then to Berlin. And of course, he was influenced by the artists that were shown at that time, the Impressionism in France, for example. But also, I think that he was very much together with other artists, and he was influenced by people like Strindberg, the Swedish author, also a painter, by the way. And I think that his environment of young artists in these towns at that time was very important for him. And to go a little bit further into to what happens with Edvard Munch, he stays outside of Norway for almost 20 years, and he is constantly working, constantly drinking, constantly sitting up at night, discussing things, philosophy, literature, art, obviously, with his artist friends. And he had a breakdown, complete breakdown in 1908. And he goes to the hospital, and he stays there, he gets dry, and he wants to go back to Norway. And he goes back to Norway in 1909, the year after. And he buys, first he rents a house in Kragerø. So there's many sites actually that is connected to Edvard Munch, sites where he worked and lived. Kragerø is one very important site in his life. And then this is just by the fjord in Oslo, by the way, and then he buys a house on the other side of the fjord in Hvitsten. And a few years later, he buys the house that he will live in for the rest of his life outside of Oslo, which is called Ekeli. And that was in 1916. So from 1916 to 1944, when he dies, he is staying in his home in Ekeli, and he's doing a lot of self-portraits, a lot of wonderful work. For example, the decoration of the university aula in Oslo, which is really wonderful, where we, for example, have the sun, or we have the history and other famous works from this decoration. That was done in 1915, so that was in this same time as he moved to Oslo. And then, of course, the war comes in 1940. He's a bit afraid what the Germans would do to him, because he had been stigmatized as entartet kunstner in Germany. So he's deprived, and he's actually part of an exhibition that the Nazis did in Germany, which is still, I understand, the most visited exhibition ever in Germany about the deprived artists. So when the Nazis came to Norway, he was afraid what would they do to him, what would they do to 2/3 of his work that he had in his home in Oslo. So he wrote this testament just a week after the Nazis came and gave everything to the city of Oslo. 4 years later, he dies in 1944. And the reason why he dies is that he goes out into the snow to work, and he gets pneumonia, and he dies the 23rd of January 1944. And then the city moves into his home and start to prepare for taking care of this vast part of his production, 28,000 artworks and another 15,000 objects, and another 15,000, almost 15,000 pages of writings. He's writing constantly. In fact, he was thinking of being a writer very early on in his life. So there is a lot of writings that you can see in one of our homepages called MUNCH.no. Please go in and have a look at this, because we have also translated a lot of his text into English. iMunch.no. And then, of course, what happens is that the city takes over, collection goes through everything, opens the museum in 1963, has been a wonderful place, lots of people have been there, but now we are making a new museum. So that's, in short, what I wanted to tell you about Munch's life. I'll take some of the questions that have come up. So, for example, we have, and I had to go back a little bit because some of the questions are a little bit older now, but from Madeline in Tennessee. How come Munch's home was not preserved and got destroyed instead? Well, that's a very good question, because we all think it was a disaster that it was destroyed. It was owned by the city. And in 63, when they opened a new museum, they also tore down his home. The home hadn't been taken care of, so it was not in very good shape. But of course, we really wished that we had his home still, but we have some of his other homes, not the one in Oslo. We have this atelier in Oslo and his farm. So you can go there and see some of the things that he actually was depicting, but don't have his home. So maybe in the future we'll recreate that, but at the moment it's torn down, unfortunately. Why are tracking devices not used on artwork to recover stolen items? Eric from Austin, Texas, United States. You know, we are not talking very much about security, but I can tell you that we have very modern equipment today that we use to recover stolen items. But I wouldn't go into details about that. But when the Scream was stolen in 2004, we were not prepared for that, because at that time we were maybe a little bit naive. All the museums were open. It was quite easy to get in, but still you cannot actually defend yourself against a robbed armory. So that happened. But after that, of course, every possible installation of security was implemented. And today we feel very safe about our collection. I think also other museums today are very, very safe places. Is there an estimated value of all of Munch's work? There is no estimated value. Kathy Louise from San Diego. Of course, if everything was put into the market at once, it probably would be less worth, and we see one work by one work being sold. But I think that there has been some estimations, but certainly many, many millions of dollars. The one Scream that was a pastel work in New York was sold for $120 million. So you can imagine if you sold some of the other famous works by him as well. Okay, so let's see. It's a very long question here from Robert Patrick Winston in Malibu, California. In our current zeitgeist, the world seems to be screaming with this current pandemic. Munch's The Scream is very appropriate for what we are going through. Do you predict the peak in interest in Munch's different variations of The Scream? The reason why I find this very interesting, this question, is that the first time The Scream was very well known worldwide was during the First World War. That was a disaster as well. A lot of people died in the trenches. And it was used in international press to depict the anxiety and the frightening times that we were experiencing during the first time. Saying we, I was obviously not living at that time. But the second time it was used was during the Cold War. For example, the Time magazine used on the front cover to depict the anxiety of the Cold War. So again, Brexit, you probably heard about Brexit. Then it was used in Britain for the anxiety of all the people that didn't want to leave or were uncomfortable with what was happening. The society was separated into two parts. One wanted to leave the European Union, and a lot of people did not want to leave. And this work again was very, I think, appropriate, as you say. So I think again we have this work that will be probably helping us a little bit to understand a little bit about anxiety and angst. The medium that he used for most of his art is from Cary Patino, Modesto, California, is the graphic works, because there is more than 20,000 graphic works, and there is almost 900 different motifs. But a lot of these graphic works still are unique examples, because he's doing different techniques while he is printing, and he's sometimes hand coloring or doing things to the works also after having printed. So there is a lot of unique works, even if there are 900 different motifs. There is 2,000 motifs in his painting production. So there is more motifs in that, but the printing is, of course, a lot more singular objects. If Munch painted any of his pictures outside of Norway, yes, certainly he was living outside of Norway for 20 years and made a lot of his most famous works outside of Norway. For example, like the Scream and Madonna. Even if they were maybe inspired by Norway, they were not actually made in Norway as such. Let's see. If Edvard Munch used photography for some of his artworks for painting, yeah, absolutely. The interesting thing, when photography came into the world, and a lot of artists used that, Edvard Munch did, first of all, use photography to try to understand visual language. And one, for example, thing that came from photography and was taken into his artworks was a double exposure. In a lot of Munch's artworks after photography, we see that we have this double exposure. There are many works on top of each other. There is shadows, there is backgrounds, there is things that makes his works maybe deeper and richer, and also certainly coming from photography. There is other aspects as well. There is a book about Munch and photography that is, I think, very interesting, talking about how the human beings in general change their visual language because of photography. Because of photography, people could look into the world in a different way, different angles, and things changed also in the arts. And Edvard Munch was certainly one that was using photography to not only understand the world in the beginning, but later on also using photography as an art, as a means of artistic expression. And we think that he might have been the first to do selfies. You know, the cameras in the first phase of cameras was very heavy, but still he held them in his hand and took pictures from the side to his face as the selfie tradition that we have today. And the interesting thing with that is that I think before camera it was difficult to see yourself from the side. You had to actually arrange certain mirrors and things. So by photographing yourself, photoing yourself, you could see yourself from the side. And there is a whole series of works about Edvard Munch's photography, doing selfies and doing other self-portraits. Brenda from California asked, did Munch have assistants or collaborate with other Norwegian artists? I would say no. He had friends that was artists, but he was very, I would say, first of all, he didn't have any assistants. So everything he does, he is doing it himself. Everything he is doing himself. Not like today's artists that has assistants that do a lot of work. Edvard Munch didn't have that. He didn't want that. He wanted to do everything himself. But he had friends that he was discussing with. But I wouldn't say any of them were very distinguished. So I think that his art and his visual language was a production of his own imagination and his own knowledge and his own investigation into possibilities. So he did not have anybody to actually help him. He was developing this entirely on his own. If any artist inspired Munch, from Lucy in Oxford, I think I also had this question last Monday. But anyway, yes, absolutely. Van Gogh is already mentioned. Impressionists, I mentioned also, but I think the whole environment inspired him. But he didn't pick very much from other artists. He was developing his own things, but certainly having influences. And we don't know if Edvard Munch was inspired when he did his Starry Night by Van Gogh's Starry Night. That was done 20 years earlier, but we think that might have been an inspiration. And we know that Edvard Munch saw some of Van Gogh's works in Paris, as Van Gogh also saw some of Munch's works. So they knew about each other. Van Gogh is 10 years younger, 10 years older, I'm sorry. And they never met, we don't think, but they certainly knew about each other. Why did Munch keep so many of his paintings as opposed to selling them, is Peter Jeffrey from Kelowna, Canada, asking. Well, actually, he did sell a lot of works when he was young and needed money. He also had a family that he supported, not his own family as kids and wife. He never established a family himself, but he had sisters. He came from a family with 5 children. Originally, one died when he was 13, his oldest sister, but the others lived on, and there is also a niece. But to live his life and to be an artist, he needed to sell. But when he didn't need to sell, he only did a few works, let's say portraits that was commissioned, that kind of thing. But he didn't sell very many of his works. And if he sold something, he probably would do another version for himself. So he always had one copy of every work that he did. That's why we basically have everything at the MUNCH Museum, because in his own collection, he kept one kind of edition of everything that he did. Not everything literally, but basically everything. There is a few exceptions to that. Are there any modern artists that have Edvard Munch for inspiration? I think a lot of artists, not only in visual art, but also in music, in theater. We see there's a lot of productions being inspired by Edvard Munch for ballet and for theater. And he actually wrote a play himself. But let's say we have Tracy Emin from the United States. Jasper Jones is very much inspired by Edvard Munch. And Andy Warhol did a whole series of Munch interpretations. So he was certainly inspired. And I think also younger artists today, we find Munch in a lot of them. And we have them as guests at the MUNCH Museum. They want to see the magazine so they can get to know him even better. So we know that Edvard Munch has a very big influence on today's art, not only in the Western part of the world, but also in China, in Japan, in the Middle East. We see that the younger artists is being very influenced by Edvard Munch and the things that he is dealing with. And actually, I wanted to say one thing about why I think Edvard Munch is so relevant even today, so many years after he died. First of all, I think he has a language that is understandable. It's quite, let's say, personal. It has a lot of strength, a lot of power, a lot of motion. But also he's dealing with a very important aspect of what it is to be a human being and all the challenges and all the situations that we have to face. And he's constantly investigating into human condition and human existential questions to see if he can understand it even better and to not only understand it, but be able to communicate this to us in a way that we might learn more about ourselves and about other human beings through his art. And that's, I think, is his strength, that he has this language that is understood by people all over the world and children even all over the world. And he has very important reflections and understandings and knowledge that he is able to communicate to us. Okay, so there's a lot of questions here now. I have to, let's say I'm taking a few more. There is Adolf Johnson from Mebane. I'm sorry if I pronounce that incorrectly. My farmor was born in Kragerø. what was significant about Munch's period in Kragerø. He did some of his very famous works there. He started on the aula decoration, I mentioned that earlier. He did the sun in Kragerø, and he did a fantastic work called The History, where there is an old fisherman that is having a kid on his lap and is telling the kid the history. So when Munch was asked to do the decoration of the university aula, the tradition was that people were depicting works from the antique, from Greece, or from academia, professors. But Edvard Munch didn't want to do that. He wanted to do a decoration based on normal people, normal in the sense that were not professors and not academics, but how is history transformed into contemporary life through a fisherman, for example, telling history to a kid. And the same is with other of his works for that decoration. It's always ordinary people, and that's why it took so many years for the university to actually acknowledge his works and to accept to have his works as a decoration for the university aula that was done at the 100-year anniversary of the Oslo University. So there are a lot of, for example, another work I like very much from Kragerø is The Galloping Horse. Have a look into that on the internet. That's a really, really wonderful work. So there is a lot of works from Kragerø. It's an important period. Okay, from Patricia in Arkansas, The Girls on the Bridge, painting of Munch. Let's say I was told is a real bridge in Oslo. Is that somewhere worth visiting? Yes, it is. Absolutely. But it's not in Oslo. It's in Åsgårdstrand, which is 100 kilometers. That would be maybe 70 miles. From Oslo. Åsgårdstrand is a place where Munch, he bought a cottage there, quite young he was when he did that, but before that even he spent his summers there. There's lots of work from Kragerø. And the interesting thing about Kragerø and some of the other places that Munch worked and lived is that you feel that you go into his landscapes. In Kragerø particularly, you see the sea, you see the light, you see the bridge, you see the houses that were there, the trees is still there, and you really feel that you're going into his landscape. So sometimes we have journalists coming to the Munch Museum in Oslo, and we tell them to go to Åsgårdstrand to experience how it is to walk into Edvard Munch's scenery, into his life, and they really enjoy that, and all of them talk about that as a big experience. So I certainly recommend going to Åsgårdstrand if you are close to Oslo. But there is also a place in Oslo, Ekeli, where you can also walk into his landscape. But Kragerø and Åsgårdstrand and Hvitsten is the three most, I think, famous places from his working production. Okay, two more questions. Let's say from Robin, Edmonton, Alberta, why SNAC will not be shown some of these artworks as they are being talked about? Well, yes, in the future we're going to present specific works. Today we understood from last Monday that a lot of people wanted to know a little bit more about Munch, and a lot of people didn't actually know Edvard Munch. They knew the Scream maybe, but they didn't know Edvard Munch, and they wanted to hear a little bit about Munch, and that's why we were not today just talking about the person Edvard Munch and not showing any works. But I think in this digital time, we're certainly going to show some of his works, talk about his works, and maybe also show some of the documentary works or pictures from his life in the future. So that's a good question. We will put that on the list and follow up on that. Did Edvard Munch use any special or different types of paint in his works like the masters did in the past? Peter Jennings is asking that. From Winston-Salem, North Carolina, United States. Yes and no. He was doing a lot of, let's say, developing his different types of paints himself. That's a big challenge for us because a lot of times we don't know what's in it. And if you want to do conservation or if you want to restore something, you need to know a lot about what he used. and he used a lot of things that was untraditional and a lot of things that was traditional. So that's a difficult task for us. But there is not one particular type that he uses. He's constantly again trying to sort out different techniques, try out different things. And another challenge with that is that a lot of the things that he's doing is very fragile. So there is a lot of conservation going into our collection. So every time we do an exhibition outside of Norway, we need to spend hours and hours and hours of conservation before we can send them when they get back, because they're very fragile. Sometimes he paints directly on the canvas. He uses different kinds of paints that are also fragile or get loose. So that's a big challenge for us as well. But yes, he's doing his own production of the paint that he uses, and he puts in different kinds of things to try to investigate and find out how he can express himself in the best possible way. So last question, which artwork would, in your opinion, provide the most complex interpretation of what he is trying to convey? That's John Odland, in Klein Village, Nevada. That's the last question for today. We'll see if there are more questions coming in. We might answer some next Monday. There is a lot of complex interpretations in a lot of Edvard Munch's works, actually. And every time we have new art historians coming in, or sometimes we ask authors or others to work on our collection, to do new interpretations, and we see that there is a lot of very complex works that he has. Of course, the Scream is already mentioned. The Madonna is a very complex work with many possible interpretations. Another work I mentioned is Between the Clock and the Bed. That's certainly a very complex work. So there's a lot of complexity, and maybe that could be maybe also a theme for one of our Museum Mondays. So thank you so much for listening in, and great to see you again. Well, please stay put next Monday, same time, same place. Then we are going to talk about the Scream and the conservation of the Scream, and I'm also going to tell you a little bit about the process that led Munch up to the work that we know today, because there was a lot of works that he did on that thematics before he ended up with the very iconic work that we know today. So that's next Monday. So until then, take care of yourself and everybody else, and thank you for listening in, and see you later. So bye-bye for today. See you next Monday. Thank you very much.